I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture.
So today on the pod, we wanted to chat about this topic of why motherhood feels more difficult than ever. And it's very topical for us because I just recently turned 30. And this whole year, it's been a big process of trying to figure out if I want to have kids, because I guess in my mind, there was always this cutoff date at 35.
To decide or to have them?
To have them. So if you do the math, because I grew up with one sibling, my husband also grew up with one sibling. So I was always like, oh, if I have kids, I'm going to have two. It's either two or none. So if I do the math and I have to have those kids before I turn 35, because 35 is when it becomes riskier. That's when you're labeled a geriatric pregnancy. And
such an insane label.
I know. Yeah, it's crazy. And so I was like, okay, well, if I have to have a baby when I'm 35, then minus a year for just being pregnant during that time, then I get pregnant with my second kid at 34. I wouldn't want to be pregnant back to back. That sounds miserable. So at least I would want a year, ideally 2 between being pregnant the first time and the second time. Okay, so if I take 34 and I subtract 2 years, then I'm at 32. That means I need to be pregnant at 31. And then let's say it takes a year of trying to get pregnant, which basically means I need to be ready to try to have a baby at 30. So that's always the math in my head, and why when it finally was oh, this year I'm turning 30, I freaked out.
I'm sitting here smirking, and if you're listening, obviously you can't see my face, but I'm just sitting here with the biggest smirk on my face because I feel like that is the exact same calculus that every single woman does, almost with those exact numbers too. I think we are all universally going through that exact same experience.
I have friends who are my exact age, but they're not with a serious partner. So for them, it's been more I feel the same pressure of the timeline, but since I'm not with anyone right now, I'm going to go freeze my eggs. And that will buy me more time, or maybe I'll get a surrogate much later down the road. But then I feel secure that I've done the fertility testing and I have X number of eggs stored. Whereas for me, because I did get married younger, I got married at 28, I've kind of been feeling oh, well, I have my person. So I just need to make this decision. It's not I need to go freeze my eggs, because I should theoretically just be able to decide. And I don't want to go through the pain of having to freeze my eggs, because it's not an easy process. You have to take shots. It takes weeks. It definitely affects your hormones. I mean, it's surgery where they actually remove the eggs from your body. And I just don't want to have to put myself through that if it's just a matter of making up my mind.
Have you and Avery been talking together about this? Or is this an internal struggle that you want to decide yourself before you even bring your partner into it?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm very much more of a planner than him. And so I think I've been thinking about this literally since January of this year. Of course, having children is something we discussed before we got married. And at the time when I was younger, when we first started dating when I was 24, I was oh yeah, of course I want to have kids. Of course, when I'm feeling older. Did? Yeah, I totally thought I would want to have kids.
That surprises me.
Yeah. I mean, because I grew up, my parents are together. They obviously had kids, me and my brother, and same with Avery's. And I grew up thinking that's just what everyone does. And sure, I'm not a particularly maternal person. I don't love kids or think they're that cute or anything. But once my biological clock gets to that point, then I'm sure I will want those things.
Mm-hmm.
So I just took it for granted. In our early conversations about it, we were both yeah, of course, one day, we'll probably both want kids.
It was probably so abstract at that point that it wasn't you can really say.
Totally.
Yeah.
And even at 28, it wasn't I was already feeling well, I probably don't want to have kids, because then we would have definitely had that conversation before we actually got married. So it was only until this year where I was oh, I feel I actually do need to decide this year, that I really was okay, let me just try to really figure out if this is something I want and block out all of the societal conditioning I've experienced to either want or not want this. And so starting in January, I really started thinking about it. I started this book. It's called The Baby Decision.
Oh.
And then when I started listening to it, I did loop Avery in, because I was actually, you need to be listening to this with me. It's by Merle Bombardieri. Hopefully I'm saying that right. She is a psychologist and sociologist, and this book actually came out in 1980.
Oh, wow.
It's one of those self-help books that I think, I was reading online for, what should I read? This was an example of a book that, very objectively talks about the choice. She has kids herself, but she's a big advocate of women who decide to be childless. And here's the framework that you can use to make this decision, which I'm a framework girl. I structure, and I the idea that, oh, if I just follow these steps and I work through the framework, then I'll reach clarity. So that's the pitch
comforting.
of the book. Yeah, it's comforting. It's if I just think through everything, then if I do decide not to have kids, I'm not going to regret that when I'm 40. Because that's my biggest fear is this is a decision either way that you can never take back. If you have kids, you can never take that back. And then if you don't have kids, you can't at least have your own biological child past a certain age.
Oh, I know. It is the most anxiety-inducing decision because there is no in between. It's so tough. I'm like trying to think if there's another decision like that in life. And I can't think of another one with that profound of an impact that is like, you've made the decision and that's it.
I don't think there is. Yeah. So I've been really stressing about it. And when I first brought Avery into the conversation, this was towards the second half of the year, closer to when I was actually turning 30. We did some of these exercises where literally you sit in chairs like facing one another and you argue for one perspective and then you argue for the other. And you decide which you're more convinced by.
Wait, hold on. We got to paint the picture here. I'm so fascinated by this. Like you and your husband are like sitting at a table across from each other. And then like one of you is embodying one viewpoint and the other one the other. And then you swap. Is that how that happens?
Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating.
And so you just like pretend that you really believe that thing that you're arguing for. And then you reflect after and you write notes about like, did that feel true and how I actually maybe feel underneath? Or was I just like playing a role? And like which perspective was more convincing?
That is so cool. I would have never thought to do that, but that's like, that's actually really useful. How did that go?
I mean, I haven't finished the book. I don't know, like it was interesting in that I was like, again, I feel comforted that there's this process I can follow, but I don't necessarily feel like it's helping me make this decision faster. And like the reason we haven't finished the book is because eventually he was kind of like, I don't think we should like put so much pressure on this decision. It's not like we're going to make a decision by end of year. Like that feels very arbitrary. And I mean, that brings us back to now, which is why I wanted to like have this conversation on the pod and like do some actual research about this topic, because I think I've absorbed all of these messages and signals like this, even this 35 thing. Is that a real clip? Do things actually get that much harder on the science side? But then also just from like a society perspective, I feel like all of the media lately has just been that being a mother is so damn hard and you sacrifice so much.
Yeah.
And especially for the woman, right? So for me, it's like, why would I pick that? Like, it seems so hard. It seems like I have to give my whole life. And when I think about my life when it comes to being childless, I'm just picturing like, oh, I could travel whenever I want. I could just have my dog plus like 2 more dogs. And how lovely would that be? My body would stay the exact same. I wouldn't be stressed about that. I wouldn't be stressed about being sick and uncomfortable for 9 months. I wouldn't be stressed about potentially not feeling maternal after I've already had a kid and like not liking my kid, or God forbid, some health issue that is in nobody's control affecting me or my child. And all of those things, they just feel so stressful and so unknown. And it's like, why would I take on any of that if I could just opt to not? And I think since it's no longer everybody has kids, we just take that for granted. And there is this choice. And I have met women, more and more women, who have thought about it and actually made the choice to remain childless. And they're like my age. It feels like, oh, am I the sucker? Am I the sucker for thinking that actually, like, maybe I do want kids? I have no idea. I've been feeling very lost. Anyway, what are your thoughts on this? I know you're a year younger than me, so I don't know if it's hit you yet or like, what's your take?
No, it's definitely hit me. So Ruben actually asked me on our first date if I wanted to have kids. Like, he was so on top of like, do you want to get married? Do you want to have kids? Like, we're getting all the big stuff out of the way within the first hour. So we've always been talking about this. And I met him when I was 26, about to turn 27. So I've been thinking about this for the past probably 2.5 years, especially after we got engaged. It's like obviously a huge thing that you have to align on. And my answer at the time, and then for the next like 1.5 years, was, I don't know, but I imagine I probably will want to one day. But if you're asking me right this second, the answer is no. And then the broader answer is I don't know. So yeah, very wishy-washy. I had no idea. And honestly, as a kid, I like never had that maternal instinct. Like I didn't want to play with baby dolls. I wanted to play with the Bratz dolls. Like I thought they were cool. Like I never thought babysitting was fun or any of that stuff. I never saw myself as a mother growing up. And it kind of scared me when I was younger and a teenager. I was like, maybe that's just something that happens later, but like I honestly don't see it for myself. So as our engagement went on and we're talking more and more about kids, Ruben was kind of like, look, I would never leave you if you never wanted to have kids, but I think I do want them. And obviously it's a decision that both of us make, but I think I do want them. And so the conversation became more like, are you willing to be open to it, instead of being like hardline no? Because honestly, as time went on, I was becoming very no to it because, to your point, like all this media that we're getting, like I was on TikTok and Instagram and like just the broader socioeconomic climate being like, this is hard. Like I see nothing but negativity surrounding motherhood. I'm somebody that enjoys my freedom. I like doing what I want to do when I want to do it, having a career. And like, there's no way I can be the person that I am right now while also being a mother. And I don't see that as an addition to my life. I see it as a subtraction. And it took me like consciously being like, okay, I'm going to be open to this. And now I'm at a point where I'm like, yeah, I want them.
Whoa. So you like 180.
I did a 180.
Wait, so what was it that convinced you? Because now you sound really sure.
Yeah, I'm like very sure.
Oh my God. Wait, help me. Help me.
So actually, I like randomly came across this TikTok account and her name is The Claire Necessities. And it was like the first time I had encountered somebody who was speaking my language when it came to motherhood. And I think she just had her kid. Yeah, she was like 6 months into motherhood with her first child and she was 29. And she was like, look, I was somebody that never wanted to be a mother. I did this for my husband. I thought I was going to be like a martyr through this entire process. And I was somebody who was like, I want kids when I'm like 60 years old and I want adult children, but I don't want to go through childhood. I was like, oh my God, that is me. Like, I always thought it'd be fun to be like older and have your adult kids home for Thanksgiving, that kind of thing. But
So you
I'm
can
like,
drink together.
exactly. I'm like, I want friends. I don't want a kid. So she was one of those people. And she was like, I think we've just brainwashed ourselves by seeing all of this negativity around motherhood. And like, I got to tell you, I'm having the best time of my life. The way that she explained motherhood was like having the most fascinating group project with your partner. And I thought that was so interesting because like I was always really afraid too that motherhood would erode my marriage and my relationship. And like I would hate my body and like I would never want to have sex again and everything negative that you could possibly think. And she was like, none of that is true. I love my body more than ever. Do I look different? Yes, but I feel empowered. I love my kid. And it's been the greatest time and I don't feel like a martyr at all. I was like, holy shit. So I started following this woman and like
did you believe her?
Yeah.
I always don't know what to believe when someone says that, you know? Could they just be playing that role? Because I feel like there's this whole world of mom influencers where that is the brand. Like trad wives, traditional wives, you know?
Oh my gosh.
It's like a whole thing. But she doesn't really sound like that. It sounds like she was converted. But I guess I'm kind of skeptical of that too. I don't know.
Totally. I mean, like basically over the past like year and a half, she's become like a full-time momfluencer. And I think she has become more like the trad wife. I mean, not to say anything negative about this woman, but she is very much playing that part. But like at the beginning when she had like 20,000 followers and I found her, it seemed very much like genuinely like, I know a lot of you are scared and I was too. And I just want to show you a different perspective.
Yeah.
And that I loved.
I have not really been exposed to any positive media around children. It sounds like you have recently and that really changed your mind. But I think for me, it's all been really all this negative stuff. For this episode, I wanted to like do some research and to really try to unpack why do I feel this intense fear around motherhood. Literally so timely. There was an article published on Vox on December 4th by Rachel M. Cohen called How Millennials Learn to Dread Motherhood. And as soon as I read the title, I was like, yes, give me, like, I feel this. I don't know why. I certainly feel like our generation in particular has just been bombarded with all this negative imagery around being a mother. And as I was reading the article, I found it really fascinating. I mean, she references a lot of surveys, including one from the Pew Research Center that said women with the most financial resources and the highest levels of education actually report the most stress and unhappiness with motherhood.
Wow.
And these are women who are very likely to have paid maternity leave and great healthcare and a committed and equal partner, right? And yet these are the women who are reporting all this unhappiness. And I guess in my head, I was like, oh, yeah, motherhood seems really hard. I guess it seems hardest for like the single mom who is maybe really young and it was an unplanned pregnancy. But that's really not what the data at least shows. And then in thinking about that more, I was like, oh, maybe it does make sense because it could be that these women feel like they have to give up so much more when they do have kids.
Oh my God, I have like a million thoughts about that. But like it intuitively makes sense to me though. If you have this big career and even if you have all the resources in the world to like send your kids to daycare and everything, like sure, you have more to give up, but also like your life is already so high stress. And to add another element of stress onto that, even if you love your children, even if you have all the resources, I think that just like it's a bomb waiting to explode. And then I also think high achieving women tend to be very type A and want to control everything and like want to do everything perfect. And they're putting very high standards for themselves on being a mother. So there's all of this self pressure combined with all of this societal pressure of all these other type A moms that they're surrounding themselves with. And then everybody's like nitpicking each other's parenting techniques and you have to be like a gentle parent. And I mean, there's just like a million ways that we're all judging each other.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's necessarily like oh, it's easier because you have resources. Like, obviously, yes, that's true. But I think like the pressure and the perfectionism that comes with being a mother at that level is also something that is not talked about enough.
So a couple months ago, I read this book, Fleischman is in Trouble. Have you heard of this? It's also
I
like a
love that
Hulu
book.
show. Oh, you've read it?
I have. Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, then we can chat about this because I picked up this book not really thinking much of it. And then as soon as I read a little bit, I was like, oh, this is going to help me make a decision about motherhood.
Oh God.
more than this like other book that I'm trying to read and like not really getting through. That's like this more objective scientific view. So I guess let's just like recap it quickly for our audience who maybe is not as familiar. The book is told from the perspective of Libby. She is a former journalist, but she hasn't worked in 2 years. She's a mom that used to live in New York, but now lives in the New Jersey suburbs. She's friends with this guy named Toby, who is one of the main characters, and he is going through a divorce with his wife, Rachel. It starts off as a story about divorce, but it's very much a story about motherhood, Toby and Rachel, the different pressures that they face. He's the man, she's a woman. And Libby, as a narrator, also makes the reader reflect on her approach to motherhood as well. All these three people are very privileged. They make plenty of money. Rachel and Toby send their kids to private school, and they have a house in the Hamptons and amazing luxuries. But they're all so unhappy and struggling. Rachel she's this woman who grew up middle class. Definitely she didn't grow up rich. She climbed her way to where she is now. There was definitely like sexism in her past that she had to like fight against. But now she's kind of there. She's made it.
She started her own PR firm.
Yeah, she's running her own shop. She's making a lot of money. She's making a lot more money than her husband, who is a doctor. And yet they talk a lot about how he's not making enough money and she's the breadwinner.
Toby, you're only making $350,000. Literally, I think that's a line in the book.
Yeah. So, I mean, these people, they are annoying. We can say that. They're like annoying and This is like very privileged. She basically has this breakdown because she just can't keep up. She feels like she's always on this treadmill of appearances, needing to make more money. Once your kid is in the private school, then you're pressured to like donate all this additional money. She's always working. She has no time to spend with her kids, but she has to work to like make the money to like afford this lifestyle that they've stumbled into and now have to maintain. And she really desperately wants to get accepted by the mothers of other children that go to school with her kids. But these moms, a lot of them don't work. They're just like wealthy because of family or
they're the trad
maybe
wives.
Their husbands. Yeah, like whatever. And there's literally this quote from the book that I wrote down. Rachel knew the truth, which was that the culture was so condescending to stay-at-home mothers that we allowed them the fiction that being a mother was the hardest job in the world. Well, it wasn't. Having an actual job and being a mother is the hardest job in the world, which is so real. And I really related to that because I'm like, if I do have kids, I'm not going to just be a stay-at-home mom. I don't come from money. And if I wanted to live in New York and be a mother, I would definitely need to still be working to like support us. And then the alternative is Libby, who moved to the suburbs. I feel like living in New York, women who currently work, who have young kids who aren't in school yet, and they need to make the decision before that kid turns 6 and has to enter first grade. Do I stay in the city, need to like really, really up my income and send my kids to private school because the public school system in New York is just so messed up? Or do I just move to the suburbs? And yeah, I never wanted to live in the suburbs. I always wanted to live in New York City, but like, I just don't think I can afford to and still give my kid all these privileges and benefits I want to give them.
I think what is really interesting about all of this is it's all centered around lifestyle. This conversation about motherhood is not even about the realities of raising a child.
I think they're intertwined because if I was wealthy enough to afford a nanny and a driver and like all these things, then I do think it would be easier to raise a kid. But if I can't, I see moms who are lugging their strollers up and down the subway steps alone. They're on the subway and no one even gives them a seat. That sucks. Like, I don't know. That sounds really miserable. It seems like, at least in the city, at least in New York, it feels like the only way to do it and not have it feel horrible would be if you had money.
I think this idea that we're all doing it alone too is part of the reason why the lifestyle of motherhood, especially for working mothers, seems so unappealing. You are relying on paid help to even be able to sustain yourself as a parent and a working person. Most of us don't live by our parents. And like, if you are lucky enough to, there's no guarantee that they're going to be your nannies like they were a few decades ago. And even childcare, most parents can't even afford childcare and also to work.
Yeah, it feels really crazy. I don't know when you read this book, but like when you read it, had you already decided like, okay, I want to have kids? Or was that like another factor and maybe not?
I was still in my deciding time and I was like, shit, I really see myself with these characters. And I have a deep fear of postpartum depression and not bonding with my kid. And Rachel suffers from postpartum depression pretty heavily in the book. she didn't bond with her children. She had a traumatic birth experience. She felt like this baby was a stranger and was always screaming and like she couldn't bond to it. And those montages of her just crying alone in the apartment when like Toby's out working and she just has a screaming kid and you're just frazzled and you're depressed and your hormones are all over the place. Like that is an image that seems so bleak and dark to me and I want nothing to do with it. So that is very scary to me. Have you ever heard of the documentary, The Business of Being Born?
No.
Oh, well, maybe don't watch it.
Oh no.
If you want full information, maybe like, yes, watch it.
Oh gosh. Is this like like, oh my God, did they film women giving birth and how shitty and horrible that is?
It's not necessarily about the natural experience of giving birth, but it's about the American healthcare system.
Oh God. So like how expensive it is to give birth.
Well, how modern medicine fucks with us when we give birth. So basically, hospitals want to turn over beds as quickly as they can. So they induce you and they give you, I think it's Pectin and your epidurals. These are actually drugs that they don't typically give overseas. I think it has to do with like the pharmaceutical companies and like everything that's going on here with the American healthcare system, which is a whole separate topic. But they do pump us up with drugs when we give birth. And it messes with the flow of hormones that you're supposed to naturally release. And it leads to a lot of C-sections because you're not progressing through the birth as you should. But it also affects your bonding hormones. So there's a much higher rate of postpartum depression in the United States. And it's also a lot higher with women who have C-sections than natural births. So when I found that out, I was like, okay, God, now I'm like really committed to having a natural birth, which sounds like hell. I was like, I'm going to schedule this thing. I'm going to wait until I have enough money to have a surrogate. And then I'm like, well, if I do that, I won't bond with the kids. So I got to go through the pain to bond with it. So that opened up a whole nother can of worms. Is that something that you've thought about in your decision to have kids or not? Or is it more like the lifestyle rather than the actual motherhood piece of it?
I think for me, it's always been like the lifestyle and I think like what I would have to give up. You cannot actually have it all, quote unquote. Like I do think you do make trade-offs in your career and how quickly you move up or how much you can work when you decide to have children. And yeah, maybe that's not true for like some women, but I think for the majority of women, they can't have the life that they would have if they didn't have children. That's the fear I have. It's actually not. I mean, yes, I'm like, in some ways, I'm like, I worked so hard for my body. Like, I've gotten so fit this year. It would suck to just have that all go away and then have to start from zero. But it's like, I know I could do that because it's 100% within my control. Assuming, of course, a normal, healthy pregnancy. Working out is one of those things where it's whatever work you put in, literally calories in, calories out, like you will see results. I don't think jobs or careers are like that at all. You can put a lot of hard work in. You can work harder than anyone else in your office, but you still might not get recognized. You still might not get promoted because there's so many other people controlling those decisions who have their own biases. There's so much luck and timing and whatever involved that I think that's what stresses me out. Some of the physical things, and obviously like postpartum depression, I mean, that's not something you can control. But I guess equally as scary to me as that is trying to maybe come back to the workforce after not working for a while and having no options. I was fascinated, like what you said about now it feels more and more like just being a stay-at-home mom is a valid option and not something lesser than being a working mom or like just a working woman. I was fascinated when I was doing research to find that like actually there was this big movement in the early 2000s saying the same thing about how women were just feeling burnt out, realizing very much like us after the pandemic that work is not everything, your job is not everything. And there was this whole slew of articles that came out talking about how women are opting out of the rat race by turning to motherhood and just becoming stay-at-home moms.
This was in the early 2000s?
Literally in the early 2000s, yeah.
That sounds like what's happening right now.
I know. And so I was like, well, why have I not heard about this? I mean, obviously in the early 2000s, we were really young.
Yeah.
We were like in elementary, middle school. So it's not like we were experiencing this. But I was like, oh, when I saw all these articles being published in like 2000, I was like, why have I not heard of this? And then I realized, oh, it was because of the financial crisis. Basically, all these women in the early 2000s opted out. Then they tried to get back into the workforce around like 2008 after they had raised their kids for a few years and their kids were now older, more independent, and they couldn't get jobs. So it actually, for us in our generation, just like who grew up like 10, 20 years later, it became a cautionary tale that if you do that, you maybe can never come back.
Yeah. I mean, that's my interpretation of being a stay-at-home mom is that you've chosen that life for yourself. Like you will never reach the same heights as if you never did that.
Yeah. And I think nowadays you have it again because history always repeats itself. And so you have the messaging of these women who've experienced that and like know the pain of that. Add to that the fact that like, I mean, we talked about this in the girl bossing episode as well, just the messaging of the book Lean In that came out in 2013 post the 2008 financial crisis. Probably as part of this reaction to women who had left the workforce and then not been able to come back. Women should just do it all and lean into both their roles as moms and also their careers. Our generation, millennials, we have so much less money with student loans and the cost of childcare and housing payments because most of us don't own our home and we're paying exorbitant rent. And that brings me to another reference to a previous episode, the Gilmore Girls America episode, where we talk about that. If you're curious to hear more about that topic, the link is in our show notes. There is this perception in the media that like it's so hard, but then there are these like actual structural factors that have happened to us and women just a few years older than us in our generation that are also facts, right? Literally because of the recession, women coming back from being stay-at-home moms couldn't get jobs, and that blocked them economically. People now have far less money and resources to be raising children, and things are way more expensive than they've ever been. With all these negative things facing us, is there another side to this?
Oh, is there? There is a whole nother side to this. It sounds a lot like what happened 20 years ago. There is a surge in people wanting that soft life, that trad wife. Well, okay, the trad wife thing is interesting because it's like a term that I feel like has popped up like just in the past year or the past few months. And I always associated that with being a religious thing. Like, oh, I want to be like the
like a
Christian.
Mormon.
Yeah, exactly. But I think in the zeitgeist right now, it means more like you are a stay-at-home mom and you're a homemaker, and that is an agreement between you and your partner is the provider and you are the homemaker, and you're not like lesser than, you're like his queen. You are like the queen of the house. And so
okay, so it's like traditional gender roles but without the stigma.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly. This whole proliferation of influencers that are not just like the momfluencers, because I feel like, I mean, I don't know, I'm not really in this space, but from what I've gathered about the momfluencing space, it's more like parenting tips and like a peek into my real life. And it's not all like pretty all the time, but it's more realistic. Whereas like this new trad wife, like soft life thing is more aspirational. Women with their hair perfectly done and like their house is really cute and they're always doing DIY projects and like the kids are happy. It just looks idyllic.
Okay, so this is like 1950s Leave It to Beaver. The husband comes home, the wife is like perfectly done up with a roast turkey.
Basically, what's so interesting to me about this is in the comments, I'm seeing not just women our age, but like younger women too, like more like Gen Z, young millennials being like, this is all I want. Like, why do I have to work? This is all I want to do. I'm languishing away at my stupid job. I just want to like make dinner for my husband and kiss my babies. And I think that is such a fascinating shift because like if you were to say that when we were like 19 years old, it would be totally unacceptable to have that worldview. Be like, why are you like even in school? Like,
why do you have no ambition?
Yes, exactly. I am attributing this to like the economic shifts and our shifts in attitudes towards work, especially after the pandemic and especially since Gen Z has entered the workforce. We've lost meaning in work and what we're doing. These young women look up and see people who like seem to have a bunch of fulfillment in their home lives and are like, why wouldn't I want that? It seems so aspirational and like they have the nice house and they are all done up and they're not living in some like shitty 1-bedroom apartment and being lonely all the time. So there's this guy that goes viral every few weeks. He's like 25 and he just sits there in front of the camera and goes, you know, I might get canceled for this, but I don't think women should work. I think women should just go to Pilates and have their brunches. And like, I see these poor girls coming out of their corporate jobs and they hate their lives. And that's not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be enjoying your life with your kids and going to Pilates. And he like does it in a kind of like a funny, but like dry delivery. And all of the comments are like, yes, king, he gets us. Like everyone is like, it is not cancelable at all.
God.
It's like almost like this liberal message, like liberal anti-capitalist message of, yeah, fuck our corporate overlords. We just want to be stay-at-home moms and take care of our babies. It's so fascinating.
That's
it's such
like,
a shift.
there's so much to unpack there. I mean, I guess it's like anti-capitalist, but it's also leaning into the patriarchy. Like, yes, man, take care of me.
Yeah. The different waves and iterations of feminism. It's been like, you're not a feminist unless you're a working mom. Or you're not a feminist unless you're embodying this identity. And it seems like we're mellowing out, hopefully, to a point where it's like true feminism is you get to decide for yourself. And you are just as hardworking and valued as a mother and a caretaker, because that is the most essential role in our society. Like we need people to take care of each other. And it's thankless work and it's unpaid work and just as valid as a working mother. And so I do subscribe to like that brand of feminism and that every woman deserves respect for their choices. But that does mean that I think women deserve the opportunity to change their mind. Like if you want to be a stay-at-home mom for 5 years because your kids are small, you should also be able to re-enter the workforce and not be like have some scarlet letter or something that like you're not as good as everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's why the decision feels so scary, because that's not how our society works today. I wish it was, but I don't think you can just like come back and pick up from exactly where you left off. I mean, this is why like the gender wage gap is not actually so much because literally for the same job, women are being paid less than men when they're both 21 and fresh out of school. But because over time, women suffer due to having been out of the workforce, and that is used as justification for why they have less years of experience and are paid less. So like it's the compounding effect of all of these years in cumulative of a life where women make like 80 cents on the dollar. So I feel like we kind of started this conversation talking about how this is such a personal decision and how we've each been approaching it and all of the factors, internal or external, that are influencing that decision. But I feel like where we've gotten to now is more about structural things that make this so hard, like the fact that it totally should be an option for women to come back, and yet structurally, because of the way that the economy is set up, we can't. And I am like very interested in this topic that America, which was like a superpower for our whole lifetimes, but now seems very much to be on the decline, I guess, just from like a cultural feeling, but also even from a population standpoint, the way that societies and civilizations gain power and rise is often correlated with the size of their population. And Jared Diamond talks about it in Guns, Germs, and Steel. Like, why did Europe take over the world? Why were they the ones to colonize everyone else? Their population was booming, and they just had so many people living in such squalid conditions that when they went all across the world and brought their diseases and everything with them, they were able to dominate. Europe has been declining. Like Great Britain used to be obviously a major colonist superpower and is no longer. And same with Japan, a major aggressor obviously in World War II. And they've been struggling with their population. China was such an economic superpower because they had so many people and so therefore had the workforce to be able to provide really cheap labor and become the factory of the world. And now, years after the one-child policy, the government is really trying to backpedal and encourage people to have 2-3 children, but people just don't want to. Like in China, it's too expensive now to have another kid. We're feeling it on a micro level where it's like, oh, like, should we even bother to have children? Like, it's so expensive now. There's climate change. What kind of world are we bringing our kids into? And then there's the macro view, which is, well, what if a bunch of women make the same decision? Like, where does that leave us?
Yeah, like what happens? Also, I got to say, I'm like really proud that we now have a podcast in which Guns, Germs, and Steel has been quoted. Did you read it?
Yeah, dude, I learned.
God, we're so
I learned about the book
smart.
in middle school. I was in a gifted program in middle school.
Of course
and like
she was.
The professor taught us that book, which I don't know, I guess that feels kind of young to be in middle school learning about that.
So young. How gifted were you, Lucy?
It blew my mind. I mean, yeah, and I feel like it literally blew my mind, that book. And yeah, now I surprisingly think about that book a lot still. And when I think about why the world is the way it is.
God, I feel like every one of those books that I read, it's like always just about Papua New Guinea, like all the time. I think this is like a great question. I did some research into this. It is true that we were having declines in birth rates. So in the US specifically, in 2009, we were at 13.5 births for every 1,000 people. And during the pandemic, it dipped a lot to, I think it was like 10.5 per 1,000. And now we're back up and slowly increasing. And we're at like 11.5 per 1,000. So we're down about 15%, which is significant, but it's not like out of this world crazy. It seems to be more of a problem on an economic scale. Like, are we going to have enough manpower to fuel Social Security and pensions for the older generation? Are our kids now going to have that same social safety net that we're providing for our elders? And I think the overwhelming answer is no. And it's also not something that we can completely attribute to just a population decline. There's so many other factors to that. The only continent that is actually seeing a population decrease is Europe. America is not seeing a population decrease. It's being offset by immigration. I should say, too, that this is a class thing. So upper class women, both in Europe and in North America, tend to have 1 to 2 children on average, whereas lower class women tend to have more. And there's lots of reasons for that. Some of them are cultural. Latin American and Hispanic cultures tend to value children and family more and are more close-knit and have that infrastructure. But there's also some lack of access to reproductive choice, too, that contributes to that.
So as countries become wealthier, they, as a whole, trend towards having less children. And that subtly affects. It's not like this giant leap in terms of the nation as a whole.
Yeah, 100%. We do have an overpopulation problem. in the world. And so it is good that we're not having, like 7 kids apiece. This class question is particularly interesting because we tend to be more isolated and fragmented as we climb up the social ladder. And that makes it much more difficult to have a child. And I was reading about how in China, they have birthing centers. And after you give birth, you basically do nothing for a month and everyone takes care of you. And it's just like universally acknowledged that you just went through something and you need time to acclimate and it's going to be hard. So we're all going to be there and take care of you for a month. And there's now even like luxury birthing centers in China and Korea, and they can cost upwards of like $30,000 a month. And they've made their way to the West, I know. And in the West, they can cost like $50,000, $60,000 a month to stay in these places.
$50,000.
I know.
Every woman deserves that, but then it sounds like you can't have it unless you're extremely wealthy.
And it's crazy, but it's also just this idea that you need community that I think we've kind of lost sight of that. That does contribute heavily to like people just not wanting to have a kid anymore as you become wealthier and more isolated. I think that's something that we need in America. Like we need subsidized healthcare, yes, we do need subsidized healthcare, but we need subsidized childcare and we need these birthing centers and just like more community for women. Really. Like how much easier would it be to like make this decision to be a mother if you're like looking around and you see people who are pregnant all the way through like, I don't know, mothers with like kids in high school and there's just built-in community with that. That would almost be like an incentive.
I think that is a benefit of motherhood. I think when you think about the option to be childless, yes, I have all this additional freedom and the life that I'm used to now, but I also do miss out on all those experiences. When I turned 30, I also told my parents, hey, I might not have a kid. And that's not something I'd ever said to them before. And I know they, of course, have always wanted me to have a grandchild for them. And when I told them, just like in a random catch-up call, I just dropped this bomb like, oh, yeah, by the way, I probably there's a real chance I'm not going to have any kids. They were actually super open. Like, I don't know. Maybe they've learned how to deal with me over the years, which is that if they act really defensive, I'll immediately shut down. But they were just kind of like, oh, interesting. My mom was like, let me tell you about why I decided to have children.
Oh,
and
that's
like
such a sweet angle.
How much it changed me and everything it brought into my life, because it's not just pain and sacrifice. And then for my birthday, so this was maybe like a month before my birthday, and then on my birthday, she emailed me a letter that she wrote. And it was basically about having kids. She wrote like, oh, on the day you were born, I was just reflecting like 30 years ago when I had you. And here's everything I've learned from being a mother.
Oh, that is so tender.
And it was really sweet. But I was also like, okay, I see you, Mom. You're like, you're strategically placing, you're incepting me.
That is so sweet, though. Oh my gosh. I think what's helped me finally decide to just say, yes, I want to do this is recognizing that I can do it my own way. All of these models that I'm seeing, like whether it be like these trad wives, which I do not subscribe to at all, or like these stressed out corporate moms who I don't want to be either. It was hard for me to find a model of motherhood that I can like look at and say like, yes, I want that. But then I finally realized that it doesn't have to look like anything I've seen before and I can make it my own. And when I started to think about what that would look like in my own life, like having an equal partner, like maybe working from home a bit, like having a nanny or like getting myself financially to a position where I can afford the resources that I would need to make motherhood look the way I want it to. That is a prerequisite for me. But once I get there and I'm able to afford that, yeah, I do see that being a really happy outcome and like something that I would have missed out on if I didn't participate in.
Yeah. I mean, there's something you're saying here about timing, right? And like when you're ready, which does have a financial factor to it, like when you've got the resources, then it would feel like a no-brainer decision. And I think part of the struggle is the fact that millennials are making less money today and have more debt than our parents. And yet you also, for women, have this biological clock where it feels like you need to make the decision ASAP as soon as you turn 30 before you hit this cliff at 35. But you might not have that much money at 30. You might not even have a stable job at 30. Like, we're both unemployed right now. Can we all just wait? Is this cutoff like a real thing? And I did some research.
Yeah, I'm so curious to hear
into trying to figure out, just medically, scientifically, is this 35 number such a short window? Literally 5 years, a real thing.
I hope not.
So I mentioned earlier that as soon as you hit 35, that is considered a quote unquote geriatric pregnancy. They have now rebranded that to an quote-unquote advanced maternal age.
Is that supposed to be
pregnancy,
better?
Which sounds so bad still. I'm like, is that the best you could come up with?
Oh my God.
The healthcare system does consider it a high-risk pregnancy as soon as you hit 35.
Really?
There are increased risk factors for 3 main reasons. The first is age-related diseases such as high blood pressure, obesity, or diabetes for the mom as you get older. Two, the number of eggs decreasing with age. Like we all know that we're born with as many eggs as you'll ever have. And the chances that the remaining eggs have some disorder that might affect fertility or the actual child are higher. And then three, lower fertility rate. But I found it really hard to actually quantify like how much higher is the risk.
Yeah.
Is this like, oh, you're all fine, and then 35, you fall off a cliff, and now it's like 20% higher risk for all these things? A C-section or a preterm birth or even a miscarriage or a stillbirth. And that's not actually true. The reason that 35 is burned into our brains is because older, outdated research said that 35 was the age at which the risk of having a fetus with an abnormality like Down syndrome equals the risk of miscarriage. And that was because the way that you tested for Down syndrome back then was this very invasive procedure called an amniocentesis, which is when you stick a needle actually inside of the belly. And so there are risks associated with that. Like you could lose a child or it could harm the mother. And so doctors needed like a rule of thumb to be able to recommend the procedure. And so they settled on 35 as like the benefit of getting that procedure outweighs the risk of a potential miscarriage. So that's actually where that number comes from. And it's outdated because we have made advances in modern science and you don't need this procedure anymore to figure out if...
Yeah, like there's different ways that they can test for like all sorts of genetic abnormalities. Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. I feel like most people don't know that it no longer applies because 35 is still the number they use. Even today, if you were to go to the hospital and say, I'm 35, I'm pregnant, they would label you high risk because of this like outdated test and the way that that's been incepted into our society. There was this article by Spencer McClelland on Slate that I really liked in particular because he just made a lot of really great points around the fact that risks increase steadily with age and at some point their rate of increases. And though some scientists and doctors have said, oh, that inflection point is at 35, the data is frankly really fuzzy. And it really depends who's interpreting. If you surveyed a bunch of doctors, some might say it's 30, some might say it's 32, some might say it's 40. It's not like there's consensus that it's definitely age 35. I was just doing some research on how many pregnancies are even happening at this age, and 19% of all pregnancies and 11% of first pregnancies are currently in those over age 35 in the United States. In 2020, the average age for first births was 27 years, compared with 21 years in 1970.
That was the average, was 21?
Yeah.
That is so young.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
There was this large study that found that 78% of women aged 35 to 40 will still conceive within 1 year. And that is compared to 84% of women aged 20 to 34. So it's actually like you're talking a 6% decline.
That's it?
In ability to conceive within the first year. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So it's very small difference compared to how it's like commonly perceived.
And okay, so like if you were to like harvest your eggs, let's say at 30 and then have a baby at 40, obviously your egg is not at risk in the same way. But like, is that still considered an advanced age pregnancy? Like if you're in really good shape and you're 40, that's obviously different than if you're not. So like, is this something that we can control?
My takeaway is basically that this number is just made up and that actually that it's really different age for every woman. If you are concerned about it, you should just get fertility testing because your number could be different, right? Like somebody could be super fertile until they're 40, and then somebody could actually be struggling with fertility even when they're 26 or 27. It just is super case by case.
If you know that you want to have kids later in life, like you can do your best to control with diet and exercise and just being as healthy as possible too. If it's like an ultimate goal of yours. I don't want to be one of those like, oh, yeah, your health is in your control 100%. Like, no, absolutely not. But like, if this is like a goal of mine is to have my first baby when I'm 40, which like, honestly, if I had to choose, I would have my first baby when I'm like 45. I would like want to delay that as much as possible and be like as stable as possible.
Okay, I'm curious, like after we've had this long conversation and like each done our own research, is there anything you've learned that is going to change how you approach this at all?
I think I might get my fertility checked. Does Modern Fertility want to sponsor us? No, I think that's like a huge one. It's like the timing. Yes, I want this to happen, but it is so dependent on the stage of life that you're in. Like having a kid right now when I'm unemployed, like don't know what I want to do with my career yet. Or like I do, but I haven't gotten there. I don't have the financial safety net that I want yet. If I were to introduce a kid into the variable right now, it would completely derail my life. And I want it to be a situation where I'm like, I am me and I'm solid in my identity and my finances. And I'm introducing a kid as like an addition, not a transformation. Yeah, I feel like that'll give me the most amount of choice. Because I do think our point earlier about like, as a woman, you don't get as much choice. Once you pick a path, you can't really stray from it. Like, I want my path to be absolutely set. And then a kid comes in and it can't throw me off.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what about you? What are your thoughts at the end of all of this?
The expectation that I will somehow magically make the perfect decision and not have any regrets is probably unrealistic. And that's putting a lot of pressure on myself to like have it figured out immediately. I think this artificial deadline in my brain, having done the research, it is like, okay, it might not be 35 for me. It might be much later, or it might already be too late. Like, I don't really know. And I've been living in blissful ignorance a bit because it's like, I want to like make a decision and not have it be based on the arbitrariness of my body. But I think like it will take time to make a decision. I am like more at peace with that now than I was earlier. And I guess I just feel like really either path I take, I just don't want to be stressed out and I don't want to be feeling like I'm not enough or that I'm always on the hamster wheel, having to like constantly run to even keep up with whatever societal expectations I'm insisting on comparing myself to, whether that is being like a really successful working mother, whether that's being a really creative person who doesn't have kids, but then is able to pursue all these things that other people aren't and like make the most of my time, quote unquote. Or if it is to just like stay at home and be a mom and have that be my main focus, I think in any of those scenarios, the biggest thing I actually need to work through is like, how do I change my definition of success so that it is not so dependent on these external factors and like other people's judgments?
Yeah.
Because I think that is what ultimately stresses me out. And unless I like get over that, I just don't know. I'm like definitely not even close to getting over that. Even the fact that like turning 30 stressed me out so much, which is just a random number. That's just society again influencing me to like care about something that really I shouldn't. Like I haven't figured out how to opt out of the system and the brain fuck that is living in society. I wish I could just be myself and not care about what other people think. And maybe for me, that's what I need to figure out. Like I need to first do that and then figure out this kids thing. And even if that takes a couple of years, maybe that's fine. Let fate happen, you know?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we have way more time than we're giving ourselves credit for. And I mean, how many people do you see that like don't even meet their partner until they're like 36 and then they have children and families?
True. They're probably so annoyed listening to us on this podcast right now. They're like, what the hell? You're married and Jennifer's engaged and you guys are complaining about nothing.
I know. You don't need to be freaking out about this now. You have so much time.
If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Full transcripts and show notes are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.